Hey everyone, thank you for visiting my channel. Today, I'm going to tell you about a case that happened in New Zealand, one of the most controversial cases in the country's history. The Bain family consisted of 6 members, and all but the eldest son, David Bain, were killed. This case is the second most debated in New Zealand, following the Pukekawa Bloodhouse case of 1970. The core of the controversy revolves around the sole survivor, David Bain, and whether he was the killer. Supporters and opponents are almost evenly split, making this one of the most famous and contentious cases in New Zealand's history. This is the Bain family murder case. Setting and the Bain family. The case took place in Dunedin, the second largest city on New Zealand's South Island, a port city with a population of about 100,000. Dunedin was built in a classic Scottish style and is often called the most Scottish city outside Scotland. At 65 Every Street, the Bain family of 6 lived. The father, Robin Bain, 59 years old, a former missionary who is now the principal of a school in a town south of Dunedin. The mother, Margaret Bain, 51 years old, a highly educated woman. The couple had 2 sons and 2 daughters. David Bain, 22 years old, the eldest son. Arawa Bain, 19 years old, the second child. Laniet Bain, 18 years old, the third child. Stephen Bain, 14 years old, the youngest son. The family lived a peaceful life here until one fateful day in June 1994, when a tragedy destroyed them. The day of the crime. Let's go back to June 20, 1994. June 20, 1994 was a Monday. At 7:09 a.m., New Zealand's emergency hotline 111 received a call reporting an incident. The 111 number is New Zealand's universal emergency line, operated by police, fire, medical services, and the post office. The operator initially didn't realize this was a murder case, thinking it might be a gas poisoning incident that killed the entire family, so they only dispatched an ambulance to the scene. It wasn't until 15 minutes later that the call center notified the police. The police sprang into action and arrived at 65 Every Street at 7:33 a.m. The 2-story house was eerily quiet, with no sounds except for the wind. The atmosphere at the scene was tense. 4 police officers exchanged glances, hesitant to enter right away. Through a second-floor window, they saw the head and shoulders of a man, the caller, David Bain, sitting on the floor with his back against the window. The officers observed for about 20 seconds, then drew their .38 caliber revolvers and cautiously entered the house. Though it was daylight, the house was dark, and the air was thick with the smell of blood. The 4 officers carefully checked each room, making sure not to touch anything before the forensic and investigative teams arrived. Discovering the crime scene. In a bedroom on the first floor, the body of Arawa Bain was found first. She was lying face down in front of the door, her legs bent, with a bullet wound through her forehead. The police cleared the first floor, confirming no one else was there, then moved to the second floor. Across from the staircase was Margaret Bain's bedroom. She had been shot in the head while sleeping, with no signs of a struggle. Next was the room of Stephen Bain, the 14-year-old youngest son. His t-shirt was torn with part of it wrapped around his neck. He had been shot in the head and was dead. His room was chaotic, covered in blood, indicating a violent struggle had taken place. In a room upstairs, Laniet Bain was found on her bed, shot 3 times and dead. The book in her hands was soaked with blood. Then, in the living room, the police found the body of Robin Bain. He had been shot in the head and was lying next to a coffee table. On the floor nearby was a .22 caliber rifle with a silencer, its barrel pointing toward his body. On a desk, a computer was on, displaying a line of text. The police found the sole survivor in the house, the person who made the emergency call, David Bain, age 22. He was in his room. When he saw the police, he started shouting, showing extreme emotional distress. At this point, the 4 officers had done their job well, conducting a preliminary assessment of the scene and securing it. Over time, forensic experts, psychologists, and investigators arrived to further examine the scene. After a series of psychological interventions, David Bain calmed down and provided his first statement. David's initial statement. He said that on the morning of the incident, around 5 a.m., he woke up. Noticing nothing unusual in the house, he took the dog to deliver newspapers, as he usually did early in the morning. After finishing the deliveries, around 7 a.m., he returned home. After washing up, he went upstairs and discovered his entire family was dead. In panic and despair, he called 111 to report the incident. Meanwhile, investigators were collecting all suspicious items at the scene. At the same time, an investigation into the Bain family's background began. Background of the Bain family. It turned out that the Bain couple had lived in Papua New Guinea for 15 years. Robin Bain was a missionary, while Margaret Bain focused on studying philosophy and astrology. In 1988, they returned to New Zealand and settled in Dunedin. After that, the family gradually faced financial difficulties. The relationship between the couple also began to crack, growing increasingly serious. They started sleeping separately. Normally, Robin Bain stayed at the school's dormitory. On weekends, he could only sleep in a camper van parked outside the house. In Robin Bain's camper van, police found 20 rifle shell casings. In a raincoat pocket, they found a trigger lock key. It seemed that, in despair over the family's situation, Robin Bain killed himself after murdering the family. As the case couldn't be that simple, they soon identified the sole survivor, David Bain, aged 22, as the suspect. After collecting a series of physical evidence, 4 days after the incident, David Bain was arrested by New Zealand police on suspicion of 5 counts of murder. More evidence was still being gathered. The first trial and evidence. A year later, the case went to trial at the Dunedin High Court. The focus of the trial was to determine whether the real killer was David Bain or Robin Bain. The prosecution first presented a series of evidence pointing to David Bain as the killer. Ballistic tests showed that the bullets that killed the family members all came from the same weapon, the .22 caliber rifle with a silencer found on the living room floor. The owner of the gun was not Robin Bain, but David Bain. On the rifle, only one fingerprint was found, belonging to David Bain. In David Bain's wardrobe, police found over 1,000 rounds of ammunition, along with a trigger lock and its key. This meant both David Bain and Robin Bain had keys to unlock the rifle's trigger. The clock in Robin Bain's camper van was set for 6:30 a.m. Forensic examination of Robin's body revealed his bladder was full. If Robin was the killer, would he wake up at 6:30 a.m., not use the bathroom after a full night, and immediately go kill people? How likely is that? The clothes Robin Bain was wearing when he died only had his own blood, not anyone else's. According to the crime scene investigation, Stephen Bain's room showed clear signs of a struggle, with the room in disarray and blood everywhere. Stephen's head was smashed during the struggle before he died. If Robin Bain was the killer, it's hard to believe he wouldn't have any blood on him. After the incident, police examined David Bain's body and found a head injury, possibly from struggling with Stephen Bain. Police tested David Bain's clothes and found blood on the edge of a pair of shorts. Testing confirmed the blood belonged to his brother, Stephen Bain. In David Bain's room, a pair of glasses missing one lens was found on a chair. The other lens was found in Stephen Bain's room. This led to the assumption that the glasses fell during a struggle between David and Stephen. In Stephen Bain's room, a blood-stained glove was found, suggesting the killer wore gloves during the act. If Robin Bain killed the family and wrote a suicide note on the computer, why would he wear gloves to hide fingerprints? That doesn't make sense. On the computer in the living room, which had the suicide note, no clear fingerprints were found. It's possible the typist deliberately wiped off fingerprints or wore gloves while typing. This raises doubts about whether Robin Bain actually wrote the note. Between Margaret Bain and Laniette Bain's rooms, several bloodstains were found, suggesting the killer moved between the rooms. The size of the bloodstains was larger than Robin Bain's feet, so police ruled out the possibility that he left them. On the washing machine, police found a blood-stained handprint with no fingerprints. Additionally, some clothes, including some belonging to David Bain, were hanging outside, clearly having been washed. Under pressure from the prosecution, David Bain provided a second, more detailed statement. That morning, after his alarm went off at 5:30, he woke up, got dressed, put on sneakers, grabbed a backpack, and took the dog to deliver newspapers. After finishing deliveries around 6:42, he returned home. He went to his bedroom, put down his sneakers and backpack, then went to the bathroom to wash his hands, cleaning off newspaper ink. He threw his clothes into the washing machine, set it to run, then returned to his room. He turned on the light and noticed bullet casings and a trigger lock on the floor. He immediately went to his mother's room and saw Margaret Bain had been shot dead. He then checked the other rooms and found the entire family dead. During this time, he heard a gurgling sound from Laniette Bain's room. He went in and found she had stopped breathing. In extreme despair, he called 111 to report the incident. David Bain added that the glasses found in his room weren't his, but belonged to his mother, Margaret Bain, and he only occasionally wore them. After hearing David Bain's statement, the prosecution immediately pointed out a flaw. In his statement, David mentioned hearing the gurgling sound as his sister was dying. The prosecution argued that only the killer could have heard this sound. Laniette Bain was shot a total of 3 times. According to forensic experts, one head wound was clearly formed later than the other 2. The prosecution couldn't explain why at the time, but they later understood. Based on all the evidence they had, the prosecution proposed a complete theory. On the day of the incident, David Bain woke up around 5 a.m., put on glasses, got dressed, grabbed a pair of white gloves, took the .22 caliber rifle from a cabinet and attached a silencer to avoid noise, took a key from a box to unlock the trigger, and loaded a magazine with 10 rounds. He first went to Laniette Bain's room, saw her reading a book on her bed, and raised the gun, shooting her twice in the head. Then he went to his mother's room and shot Margaret Bain through the forehead while she slept. Next, he went to his brother Stephen Bain's room. Seeing Stephen fast asleep, David Bain raised the gun and shot, but the gun jammed, waking Stephen. The two began to struggle. During the struggle, Stephen's head was smashed and blood splattered on David. David grabbed Stephen's t-shirt, choking him until he lost consciousness and couldn't resist. Then David took the gun, loaded a new round, and shot him in the head, killing his dying brother. After that, David went downstairs to Arwa Bain's room. Opening the door, he saw Arwa trembling and kneeling, begging for mercy, likely having heard something. But David ignored her, raised the gun, and shot. Having lost his glasses during the struggle with Stephen, his vision was affected, and the first shot missed. Without hesitation, he fired another shot into his sister's head, causing her to collapse. This explains why Arwa's legs were bent when police found her, as she was shot while kneeling. Afterward, David returned to the second floor, hearing the gurgling sound from Laniet Bain's room. He went back in, pointed the gun at her head, and fired another shot. This explains why Laniet had 3 bullet wounds in her head, with one formed later than the other 2. David realized his glasses were missing, so he returned to Stephen Bain's room to look for them, finding only the frame without one lens. This also explains why there were several bloodstains in the hallway. He then went to the laundry room, took off his bloodstained clothes, and threw them into the washing machine. In doing so, he accidentally left a bloodstained handprint on the machine. At this time, Robin Bain was fast asleep in the camper van outside, completely unaware of what was happening in the house. David changed into clean clothes and calmly took the dog to deliver newspapers. While delivering, he thought about how to perfect his plan. After finishing deliveries around 6:42 a.m., David returned home. He went to the second-floor living room, turned on the computer, and typed a suicide note in his father's tone. David knew his father's daily routine. Robin Bain went to the second-floor living room every morning to pray. Knowing the time was near, David took the gun and hid behind the living room window. Moments later, his father entered. As Robin knelt by the coffee table to pray, David stepped out from behind the window and shot him in the head, ending everything. He then placed the gun on the floor, its barrel pointing toward his father, staging a suicide scene. Afterward, he returned to his room and called 111 at 7:09 to report the incident. Regarding the prosecution's allegations, David Bain denied guilt, claiming he was innocent. His lawyer stated that David Bain had no history of mental illness or violence. Additionally, the prosecution failed to provide the most critical motive for the crime. What deep hatred could have driven David to brutally kill his family? The prosecution argued that proving a motive wasn't necessary for their case. Their responsibility was only to prove that the defendant achieved the purpose of the crime. On May 29, 1995, the Dunedin High Court, after 3 weeks of thorough examination, found the evidence conclusive, and the jury reached a consensus. David Bain was convicted of all 5 counts of murder. The court sentenced David Bain to life imprisonment without parole for 16 years, not including the year he had already spent in jail. David was, of course, dissatisfied with this verdict and immediately prepared to appeal. The reason for his confidence was that a critical piece of evidence was not accepted by the court. During the trial, a key witness highly favorable to David appeared, named Dean Caudle. Dean Caudle was a friend of Laniet Bain. He provided information that Laniet Bain had told him her father, Robin Bain, repeatedly sexually abused her and forced her into sexual relations. Right before the murders, Laniet Bain planned to expose her father's vile behavior. This testimony was shocking. Robin Bain, who always appeared as a kind missionary and school principal, had been sexually abusing his own daughter? If this scandal had been exposed, Robin Bain would have been utterly disgraced. Thus, this was the motive for Robin to kill the entire family. He couldn't let this news spread. However, when the court received this information and requested Dean Caudle to testify, at the critical moment, Dean Caudle suddenly disappeared. As a result, this evidence was not accepted by the court, and the jury was completely unaware of this story. If this evidence had been accepted, the trial's outcome might have been different. This was the biggest reason the defense was dissatisfied with the verdict and requested an appeal. Soon after, news spread that Robin Bain had forced his daughter into sexual relations and killed the family to prevent exposure, causing significant public uproar. Supporters of David Bain's innocence stepped forward, arguing that the police investigation lacked transparency and the court's conviction was irresponsible. After David Bain was sentenced to life imprisonment, Dean Caudle suddenly reappeared. After the scandal about Robin Bain spread, two of Lynette Bain's close friends before her death also came forward to testify. Lynette had told them she had considered suicide. Lynette's painful experiences may have started when she was 11 years old. As the scandal about Robin Bain spread wider, supporters of David Bain's innocence stood up, arguing that the trial was unfair and justice had been obscured. David's lawyer, Michael Guest, used Dean Caudle's testimony as new evidence and filed an appeal with the Court of Appeal. However, unfortunately, in December 1995, the Court of Appeal rejected David Bain's appeal, citing insufficient evidence. It seemed that David's chances of overturning the case were slim, but at this moment a savior for David appeared. This person was Joe Karam, a former star of New Zealand's national rugby team, very famous in New Zealand. After retiring, he became a successful businessman. Joe Karam had been quietly following the Bain case from the start and firmly believed David Bain was innocent. He was highly dissatisfied with the court's rushed conviction. In January 1996, after learning that David's appeal was rejected, Joe Karam decided to publicly support David. He used his influence and resources to generate media attention. He organized David's supporters, raised funds, and hired skilled lawyers Colin Withnell and Stephen O'Driscoll to replace the previous lawyer Michael Guest. Joe Karam met with David Bain multiple times to discuss appeal strategies, speaking out boldly. His goal was to draw more attention to the case. In April 1996, David's legal team filed an appeal with the Privy Council in London. New Zealand, as a Commonwealth country, could appeal to the Privy Council as a final resort. However, unfortunately, the Privy Council deemed the evidence insufficient to overturn the case, and the appeal was not supported. In 1997, Joe Karam published a book titled David and Goliath. David and Goliath is a story from the Old Testament about David defeating the giant Goliath, a classic Western tale of the weak triumphing over the strong. Joe Karam used this to imply the police's dominance. From the start, they targeted David Bain, focusing their investigation on gathering evidence against him while deliberately ignoring evidence in his favor. Karam argued that despite David Bain's weak position, justice would eventually prevail. That's why he titled the book this way. In the same year, another book about the Bain case was published, titled The Mask of Sanity by James McNeish. At the time, the Bain case was garnering widespread attention across New Zealand, so both this book and David and Goliath became bestsellers. However, the perspective in The Mask of Sanity was completely opposite to David and Goliath. Author McNeish firmly believed David Bain was the killer, without any doubt. He stated that after the incident, David Bain showed no guilt for his murders, as if nothing had happened. The book's author studied the Bain family psychology for years and proposed a motive. David was deeply influenced by some of his mother's religious beliefs, so he killed the family to completely free them from suffering. As the case gained more attention, Joe Karam finally achieved his goal. Soon after, a wave of public opinion began to form in New Zealand. More and more prominent figures came forward stating that David Bain was wrongfully convicted and the court's verdict was unfair. In May 1997, Under public pressure, New Zealand Police Commissioner Peter Doone announced the formation of an independent investigation team for the Bain case. This team, guided by New Zealand's Police Complaints Authority, reviewed the 1994 investigation of the Bain case. The investigation included, but was not limited to, the actions of the police officers involved at the time. As the independent investigation proceeded, new details about the Bain family's background emerged. It turned out that Laniette Bain had a rebellious personality. She later became addicted to drugs and even worked as a prostitute. She frequently made untrue statements. Her friend, Dean Cottle, the key witness who reappeared later, had acted as a pimp for Laniette. As a result, they had more interactions than others. Dean Cottle learned about Robin Bain's vile behavior from Laniette's own words. The reason Robin Bain killed the entire family instead of just Laniette Bain was that the day before the incident, Laniette had told the family about her father's misconduct. Thus, the entire family knew about it. Therefore, Robin Bain had to kill the whole family to ensure the news of his sexual abuse of his daughter wouldn't spread. However, after investigation, the independent team found no concrete evidence to support this theory. It was only a one-sided account from Laniette Bain to Dean Cottle. Evidence showed Laniette often lied, so such testimony was hard to trust. The independent investigation reviewed the police's 1994 procedures and concluded that the entire process followed regulations, with no evidence of the police fabricating evidence. Regarding the defense's claim that the prosecution interfered with the jury, there was no basis for it. Notably, the Bain family home at 65 Every Street was burned down 2 weeks after the 1994 incident. This was at the request of the Bain family's relatives, with David Bain's consent. At the request of the family, the Dunedin Fire Department, ensuring safety, completely burned down the house. With it, any evidence that investigators might have overlooked in the house was also destroyed. Any small clue could have restored the truth, but now everything was reduced to ashes. Ultimately, the independent investigation concluded that the police investigation followed regulations, and the court's verdict had no issues. Thus, David Bain's appeal was rejected again. However, David's legal team didn't give up. In June 1998, they requested a pardon from New Zealand's Governor-General. Because of this, New Zealand's Ministry of Justice conducted another investigation from 1998 to 2000. The result was that the court's verdict had no issues and didn't meet the conditions for a pardon. Still, David's legal team didn't give up. In 2003, David's legal team gathered new evidence and filed a second appeal to the Privy Council in London requesting a retrial. After reviewing the new evidence submitted by David's legal team, the Privy Council ordered New Zealand to retry the case. In April 2003, New Zealand's Governor-General referred the Bain case to the Court of Appeal for a retrial. What new evidence did David's legal team find that made the Privy Council change its mind? Let's take a look. New evidence in the appeal. On the day of the incident, David Bain was carrying a yellow backpack while delivering newspapers, and David described his delivery route that day. After finishing deliveries, David Bain returned home around 6:42 or 6:43. In the 1995 trial, a witness confirmed seeing David enter the house at 6:45. The witness also described to police seeing someone with a yellow backpack entering the Bain house, matching David's description. This evidence was highly favorable to David. However, in the first trial, the witness wasn't asked about the backpack, so the jury was completely unaware of this detail. In the first trial, the jury was told that the computer in the second-floor living room, which had the suicide note, was turned on at 6:44 a.m. This time was determined by a computer consultant from the University of Otago. But on the day of the test, he didn't bring a watch and borrowed one from a police officer. That watch had no second hand, and its intervals were in 5-minute increments, leading to an error. After recalculation, the computer's startup time was corrected to 6:39:49 a.m. This was earlier than the time the witness saw David return home at 6:45. Thus, this new evidence discovered by David's legal team could prove the computer was turned on before David returned home. We know that a pair of glasses missing one lens was found on a chair in David Bain's room. The other lens was found in Stephen Bain's room. Therefore, in the first trial, the prosecution assumed the glasses fell during a struggle between David Bain and Stephen Bain. According to David's testimony, the glasses weren't his, but his mother's, and he only occasionally wore them. An optometrist confirmed the prescription stating the glasses belonged to David Bain. But soon after, the optometrist corrected that there was an error in the test, and the glasses might not belong to David. However, in the first trial, the prosecution only used the optometrist's initial statement, not mentioning the correction, and compared it to David's account, significantly reducing the jury's trust in David's account, interfering with their independent judgment. In the first trial, the prosecution claimed that the gurgling sound from Lynette Bain as she was dying could only have been heard by the killer. But the Privy Council disagreed, stating this assumption was too speculative, so this unfavorable evidence against David was dismissed. In the 1995 trial, the most damning evidence against David was his fingerprint on the .22 caliber rifle with the silencer. The fingerprint was on a blood stain, forming a bloody fingerprint. DNA testing revealed surprisingly that the blood wasn't human, but rabbit blood. The .22 caliber rifle was typically used for hunting, so animal blood on it was normal. Thus, the most unfavorable fingerprint evidence against David was deemed invalid. In the 1995 trial, the prosecution's forensic results claimed that the blood stains between Margaret Bain and Lynette Bain's rooms were larger than Robin Bain's feet, ruling out the possibility that he left them. After David's legal team reinvestigated this evidence, it was found that the jury at the time was not informed of the foot sizes of the two individuals or the specific size of the bloodstains, only receiving the prosecution's conclusion. Now, looking at the numbers, Robin Bain's foot size was closer to the bloodstains. If these weren't left by Robin Bain, they were even less likely to have been left by David Bain. The bloodstains, once highly unfavorable to David, now became favorable. The 2009 retrial. On May 15, 2007, the Christchurch Court of Appeal held an evidence hearing. Based on the series of new evidence provided by David Bain's legal team, David Bain, who had been imprisoned for 13 years, was granted bail. The Court of Appeal announced it would set a date for a retrial. On March 6, 2009, after the jury was sworn in, the case began its retrial at the Christchurch Court of Appeal. In addition to presenting the new evidence, David's legal team listed evidence suggesting that David's father, Robin Bain, was the killer, further proving David's innocence. The legal team pointed out that information about Robin Bain's mental state was completely omitted in the first trial, leaving the jury unaware. In reality, Robin Bain's mental state had issues. As a school principal, he had once assaulted a student and wrote a gruesome story in the school magazine describing a series of family murders. The key witness in the first trial, Laniet's friend Dean Cottle, didn't testify. But now, not only did Dean Cottle testify, but two other witnesses were found, confirming that Laniet had similar conversations with them, increasing the credibility of this evidence. The weapon used was a Winchester .490.22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. The rifle was already long, and with the silencer attached, it was even longer. Thus, in the first trial, the jury generally believed it was impossible to use this rifle for suicide. On this issue, during the trial, David's legal team called a key expert, British forensic firearms specialist Philip Boyce, who had extensive experience in investigating weapon-related crimes. What followed was a dramatic moment in the courtroom. Philip Boyce held the rifle in the middle of the courtroom, preparing to demonstrate to everyone how it could be used to shoot oneself. Though the rifle was long, it wasn't entirely impossible to use for suicide. You just needed an object for support, and that object was a chair. At the crime scene, there was indeed such a chair next to Robin Bain's body. Philip Boyce placed the barrel on the chair, aiming at his left temple, the exact spot where the bullet entered Robin Bain's head. With the chair's support, it was easy to complete a self-inflicted shot. Alternatively, one could place the rifle on the floor, kneel on the chair, and use the chair as a support, allowing the body to lean forward so the hand could reach the trigger to fire. Philip Boyce added in court that this theory had been professionally and rigorously tested with the weapon. After firing, the bullet's force would penetrate the head, creating a wound consistent with the one on Robin Bain's head. The only regret was that no blood from Robin Bain was found on the rifle or silencer. Otherwise, this theory could perfectly explain everything. As soon as this evidence was presented, the courtroom erupted. The widely accepted conclusion that suicide was impossible was completely overturned. The Court of Appeal's retrial lasted 3 months, with both the prosecution and the defense calling nearly 200 witnesses. On June 5, 2009, the jury reached a consensus. The Christchurch Court of Appeal declared David Bain not guilty and released him on the spot. As soon as the news broke, supporters of David Bain waiting outside the courtroom went wild. Major New Zealand TV stations practically broadcast the case live. Such a reversal seemed unbelievable. Details that seemed like they belonged in a movie were now happening in real life. After David Bain successfully overturned his conviction, some were overjoyed, while others were worried. Those opposed to David couldn't believe that someone responsible for 5 deaths could walk free. Journalist Martin van Bynen, who closely followed the case, captured a photo after the trial showing a juror excitedly hugging David. Later, Bynen revealed more. 2 jurors during the trial continuously exchanged information. An anonymous source disclosed that during the trial, any juror leaning toward finding David guilty was privately contacted by these 2 jurors. The content of these communications is unknown. This trial broke a record. The cost of the 2009 retrial exceeded $4 million, and combined with previous costs, The total surpassed $7 million, making it the most expensive trial in New Zealand's history. After being released as not guilty, David Bain went on a 3-month vacation in Europe, with all expenses covered by his supporters. 10 months later, David Bain began looking for work, wanting to quickly return to a normal life. In March 2010, David Bain requested compensation from the government for wrongful imprisonment. However, the court stated that his case did not meet the government's compensation criteria, and the government had no obligation to pay him any money. Legally, there wasn't enough evidence to convict David Bain, but this didn't prove he didn't commit the murders. These are two different concepts. Unless David had sufficient evidence to prove his innocence, the government could compensate him. The New Zealand Herald conducted a public opinion survey, showing that 74% of the public believed David Bain should be compensated by the government. In 2016, New Zealand Justice Minister Amy Adams stated that the government would not apologize or compensate David Bain for his time in prison. However, the government agreed to pay David $925,000 as a special compensation to end his prolonged compensation claims against the government. Eventually, David's legal team accepted this compensation. With that, the Bain case temporarily concluded. However, public debate over whether David Bain was the killer continued, with neither side fully convincing the other. The case became one of the most controversial cases in New Zealand's history. Is David Bain the killer? Perhaps only he knows.